this video, while you're still working on Unit 1, stop right here. You need to wait till after the Unit 1 test to start looking at this. Now, business cycles are a topic that comes up quite frequently in the macroeconomy, and although textbooks place them in different spots, I always find that starting off Unit 2, talking about business cycles is the best way to begin, and then deal with some of the parts of it individually as we go. And so we're going to first of all start off by talking about what the heck are business cycles anyway. And so let me go ahead and share the screen. And let's go to our PowerPoint. I don't want OneNote. And we're going to talk about what business cycles are. Business cycles refer to fluctuations in the level of economic activity over the progression of time. What we see over here is a nice generic business cycle, and you notice it's rising, it's peaking, it's dropping, it's bottoming out and rising again and so forth. But the problem with this business cycle is, well, using the models at hand is a little bit too smooth. And one of the big problems with business cycles is the name seems to imply some kind of regularity, and business cycles are highly irregular. So let me do a little bit better job with paint over here. And so I'm going to take my pen here, and I'm going to you see what a false top, and then kind of goes up, then maxes out, and then kind of starts doing this kind of number again. I want you to notice how irregular it is. You got a couple of false bottoms here before you really hit the bottom, and then you can be plateaued at the bottom for a while before going back up again, and there we are. This is a much better representation of the business cycle. You'll notice it's very jaggedy. That's because the economy is kind of like an engine with a misfiring piston sometimes. It kind of increases and decreases and fits and starts. So you notice that at times it even plateaus a little bit before it actually, starts to get moving again. The upward and downward movements here create a series of what we call phases. Some textbooks will break them down into as few as 2 phases. I'm trying not to roll my eyes here. Some will do 3 or 4. However, the best version of the model is a 6-phase model, which we'll get to in just a second. But first, I want to talk about this blue line here called the trend line. The trend line is not the actual path of economic activity. The green jaggedy path you see there is the actual path of economic activity. The trend line is like a direction vector. It shows the general direction in which the economy is heading. And whichever economy this is representing, it's obviously got a positive slope trend line, which means the economy is growing over time. However, it does not grow in a linear fashion. Sometimes growth accelerates, sometimes it plateaus, sometimes it declines, sometimes it bottoms out. But the trend line is kind of like an automatic moving average, which shows on average this is the way the economy is heading. But remember about averages. An average performance has got pieces of data that are all over, above, and below the average, and that's kind of the point of this here. The actual path is not smooth, it's not regular. The general progression may be upward, but the actual path is upward and downward. Now, if we're going to divide this into phases here, I'm going to go ahead and mark off the phases in different sections. And so starting at the trend line, and excuse me, that's not what I wanted here. Give me a moment, please. Starting at the trend line on the upslope of the business cycle. Okay, that's not what I wanted either here. And then going all the way up to where it hits the top, that's phase 1, which we call the expansion phase. And then over here where it plateaus at the top, that's phase 2. That's called the peak. And then on the downslope after the peak, yet still above the trend line, that's called contraction. And then on the downslope below the trend line, that's phase 4 called recession. This bottom plateau here is called trough. That's phase 5. And then the upslope after the trough is phase 6, and that's called recovery. And then a new business cycle starts, and it's back to an expansion again. I want you to notice we don't have a point minimum or a point maximum. You can actually be like an airplane flying at a cruising altitude for a while. You can be a submarine going forward at a cruising depth, but we don't have point minimums or point maximums here for peaks or troughs. They can be sustained for a while, for many months, maybe a year or so, but they eventually drop down just by the virtue of the nature of the beast. Now we're going to go back over here to the more smooth looking graph, where it has all of the items marked here. And so we're going to talk about each phase and about what changes in each phase. Expansion suggests growth. Peak suggests maximizing. Contraction and recession suggests decline. Trough suggests bottoming out. And recovery suggests growing again after decline, but not quite reaching where you left off, if you will. During each phase of the business cycle, we've got 5 different pieces of macro data we take a look at, and these data may or may not change differently during different phases. And so let's go to the next slide here. Total spending, the consumer price index, gross domestic product, the rate of unemployment, and the labor force participation rate are the 5 pieces of data we're going to look at. Total spending, sometimes called aggregate expenditure. This is all the spending by households, plus all the spending by businesses, plus all the spending by government, plus all the spending in the foreign sector. This here is spending by all the spenders in the economy, households on final goods and services, businesses on finished capital resources, the government on goods and services and finished capital resources, and the net difference between exported and imported final goods and services and finished capital resources in the foreign sector. All that spending in the current year is going to be about 20 trillion with a T. That's 20,000 billion or 20 million if you prefer, dollars for 2017. Now, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is one of several measures of what we call aggregate, meaning overall price levels. It primarily is measuring the impact of final goods and services that are bought by households and the collective batch of them. Think of it as a group of goods and services an average household buys every year, like money spent on mortgage or rent, money spent on gasoline, food, electricity, internet service, cell phone service, entertainment, clothing, and education, and the like. It measures the collective price of all of these and kind of makes geographic adjustments, but it presents kind of like an average notion of where prices are. It measures prices in the current year relative to what they are in a reference or base year. But it measures the impact of overall prices, and it's used to determine rates of inflation, among other things. Gross domestic product has multiple approaches. It can be a measure of total spending in the economy. It is also a measure of productivity in the economy. We often consider it our main measure of economic activity. The unemployment rate, not everybody in the population is in the labor force. It's a percentage of labor force members unemployed as of the official day of record. We get an average for the year based upon behaviors, but it gives us a notion of people that could and are able to work and want to work, but are having trouble finding a job for whatever reason. Not all unemployment is bad. All of these data we're going to learn about in more detail as Unit 2 unfolds. Now, last but not least is a different piece of data called the labor force participation rate. You've got the general population, about 335 million people in the United States. Now, of that 335 million people, maybe 180 million are employment eligible, meaning that, you've got people that have no legal restrictions, no physical restrictions, no mental restrictions, no age restrictions, nothing that prevents them from being able to take a job. And then out of that 180 million people, you've got maybe 100 to 120 million people, depending upon who you talk to and how they measure it, who are actually actively participating in the labor force. The thing is, if you have no restrictions on your ability to work, legal, physical, mental, or otherwise, but you choose not to work and not to apply for a job, you're not in the labor force. To be in the labor force, you have to have no restrictions against working, and you have to either actively be working or you have to be actively filling out applications and looking for a job. A labor force participation rate of 70% or higher is considered healthy. Once you get down below 60%, it's considered unhealthy. We're right around 60 to 61% right now, but it has been improving this year. Now, during expansion of the business cycle, which is the upturn of the business cycle above the trend line, meaning the economy is actually growing faster than the average and is pulling the average up, okay, total spending is increasing. Up arrow means increase, down arrow means decrease. Flat bar means does not change. Big up arrow, big increase. Big down arrow, big decrease. Little up arrow, little increase. Small down arrow, small decrease. Total spending, Consumer Price Index, and gross domestic product all increase. The expansion suggests economic growth, and this is stuff we would expect. Unemployment rate decreases. People that are able to work and actively looking for work are more likely to find work. And then we also have growth in the labor force participation rate. People that may have dropped out of the labor force for whatever reason in previous times are either coming back to the labor force, or we have a bunch of new people coming in. Now, growth can happen for a while, but sooner or later the economy maxes out, and that's where we reach what we call the peak of the business cycle. What's interesting about the peak is that both gross domestic product, which is our measure of production in the economy for this context, stops increasing. That's what flat bar means, stops changing. Okay, and unemployment stops decreasing. Class, we never get a 0% unemployment, and we never get 100% unemployment. We also never get $0 of GDP. GDP basically always has a baseline level based upon the current business cycle. But these stop changing. GDP maxes out and unemployment minimizes. We actually see a faster growth rate in labor force participation. This is when a lot of people who may have left the labor force during the previous recession have come back because things are at their best. But spending and prices keep rising. And some people say, why is that the case? Well, imagine you want to go to a Houston Texans game and all the tickets are sold out as far as the box office prices are concerned. And so you go to a ticket broker, and if a lot more people want to fill the stadium than there are seats available, those ticket broker tickets are going to go up, up, up. People want to buy more than is produced here. And so when people want to spend more money, but there's not an increase in production, it drives prices up. So we have some inflation we will note during peak. Peaks can last for many months, maybe a year, but sooner or later, we're going to reach a point where, especially if you've had a large group of people, I like to call them a cohort, who have just bought their first homes, their first new cars, their first major appliances and whatnot. And usually once somebody has made all these major purchases, they then all of a sudden have a bunch of bills and have to start cutting back on some new purchases. And so on its own, spending is going to first stop increasing and then decrease a little bit as we see phase 3 on the downslope, the contraction of the business cycle. GDP starts to decrease a little bit and unemployment rates start to increase a little bit. But let me talk about this here. This is not involuntary unemployment. This is a case of shrinkage of the labor force or the actual employed in the labor force by attrition. I worked in a bank where we were told that if somebody quit who works 20 hours or less, we weren't to hire a replacement, just reassign their hours and duties elsewhere. And we actually had 2 people quit. We weren't allowed to hire a replacement for either of them, so we just reassigned the duties and just made do with 2 fewer people. Nobody got laid off, nobody got fired, but we shrunk our workforce through natural attrition. We see a stabilization of the participation rate in the labor force, mainly because of the fact that we've kind of reached, like, shall we say, our largest labor force for the current business cycle. And at this point, since we're not seeing more growth in employment and we're starting to see some unemployment, it's kind of discourages new entries to the labor force. The thing about contraction is, think about contraction as a cool front. All of a sudden, the temperatures are in the mid-60s when they've been in the upper 70s for a while. Not the same as a cold front. When you're on that downslope, time marches forward and you start to get behind the trend line or under it. That's where we have recession. That's the stuff that people really worry about, especially. During recession, we see significant decreases in total spending. We start to see price levels drop a little bit. Prices always seem to be out of sync with the economy after a turn. Gross domestic product starts to decrease significantly, and we start to see an increase in the unemployment rate. This is where we start to see the so-called cyclical unemployment caused by recession. This is where people have shrunk their labor force through attrition, and they start laying people off. Last in, first out, or actually first fire all the slackers, and if that doesn't work, last in, first out. Then you try to basically find the biggest cuts you can make, push the old people to retire, that kind of thing. The unemployment rate starts to go up. In this case, it's not voluntary. People don't want to become unemployed, they just do. And then we start to see a decline in the labor force participation rate. Some people have been unemployed for a while, stop applying for work, and drop out of the labor force. Some people find ways to retire and they don't come back. Recessions can take a while to hit the bottom. You need to be aware of that. They can take a while, but sooner or later they will hit the bottom, and that's where you hit the trough. That's where it's as bad as it's going to get, and it won't get any worse. During the trough of the business cycle, we see total spending stabilizes. It doesn't increase, it just stops dropping. GDP also stabilizes. It doesn't hit zero, doesn't keep decreasing, it stops dropping, doesn't rise. Unemployment stops rising. It doesn't hit 100%, it hits a maximum for this business cycle, but it does not increase any further. But we start to see big drops in price levels. When the economy hits rock bottom at the trough, that's where price levels catch up with the rest of the economy, and we see a faster decline in the labor force participation rate. Now, last but not least, it's always darkest before the dawn. After that trough, you start to see the upturn in the business cycle again. That's called recovery. That means things are starting to get better and we're heading back towards that trend line. Spending increases a little bit. GDP increases a little bit. Unemployment rate drops a little bit. People that got laid off come back part-time. People have had their hours cut, start to be scheduled for more hours. But notice we have a stabilization of price levels. Prices reach a minimum, a stable low level for this business cycle, and we see a stabilization of the labor force participation rate. Again, we'll probably see the worst participation rate of all during recovery. Now, of course, I typically ask students every semester, where are we in the business cycle? And the thing is, for the last few years prior to 2017, most students were telling me we're in recovery. This year, I've been hearing more students, this is 2017, by the way, saying we're in expansion, though some people may be hesitant to say this due to the two big tropical storms that have hit the country. And so it's always good to be looking at this data because these are characteristic of where we are. These show where we are. Of course, what people want to do is they want to find ways to predict this business cycle, and that's where there's, certain concepts come in. But before we get to that, though, people often wonder, what's the root cause of business cycles? And I've got a short list here. If I were to march 20 economists into the classroom and ask them what causes business cycle, you would start to hear name dropping. Thomas Malthus's expansion and contraction of population is one cause of business cycles because population growth tends to lead to recessions, population decline tends to lead to stabilization. Alexei Kondratyev said that when technology develops, we start to see a positive increase in the slope of the trend line over multiple business cycles called super cycles. Karl Marx always said that capitalism was unstable because it creates an unequal distribution of wealth, and that recessions, depressions, troughs are caused by this unequal distribution of wealth, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is, you could hear all these different theories and all this name dropping, but probably the smarter person would ask, well, what's the root thing that's going on? What do all these things have in common? And that's what this last statement is. Changes in the level of, and this is the theme of macro, by the way, total spending in the economy. Notice whenever total spending is rising, recovery, expansion, peak, we are on the upturn of the business cycle. Recovery, expansion, peak. Whenever we are on the downturn of the business cycle, contraction, recession, into trough, spending is dropping. The bottom line here is total spending changes for a long list of reasons why. But it's the changes in total spending that actually cause the business cycle to actually occur. If we had a constant, never-changing rate of total spending, we'd have a flat line in our economy. If we had a steady 1% increase in spending every year, we would have a positive slope line for the business cycle. But that's not the way it works. It accelerates, it plateaus, it declines at variable rates, and that's what leads to the cyclical behavior. Now, how to predict changes in the business cycle? Predict changes in total spending. And so I've already mentioned here that total spending is the theme of macroeconomics. It's a root cause of business cycles. Our formula for GDP we're going to learn about in the next video, the next classes, is called aggregate expenditures, meaning total spending. Demand pull inflation is increases in price levels caused by increases in total spending. Foreign exchange rates for currencies shifts net export spending, which is part of total spending. And the aggregate demand curve, which we'll learn about in Unit 2, shifts left or right based upon either decreases or increases in total spending. And in Unit 3, the two types of macro policy we'll learn about, fiscal policy, monetary policy, are both designed to influence total spending. That is the theme of macro. So predict total spending, and then you predict the business cycle. But we don't look at just one indicator. We look at a bunch of them. Some examples of leading indicators. The average work week. We look at 6 weeks to 3 months. If we look at hourly wage workers, and if steadily over 6 weeks to 3 months, the number of hours worked per week increase, then we can expect spending to increase. Well, why is that? What happens to your paycheck if you're paid by the hour and work more hours? That's right, bigger paycheck, more spending. A steady decline in the average work week over the same period. You work fewer hours, smaller paycheck, less spending. Class, please keep in mind you could have a case of one indicator being inconsistent. The average work week did not change for 3 months, or if it went up and then went down, and when they went up and then went down every other week, increasing, decreasing, we call that inconsistent behavior. That makes it useless as an indicator, and that applies to all of these. Another one would be changes in the stock indices. Index is singular, indices is plural. If you start to see increases in the price of different stocks, that typically means businesses are profitable, which means people are buying what they're selling. And usually the Dow Jones Industrial Average is one of the best of those leading indicators. So the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are looked at as well. A steady rise in stock indices, more profits, more spending. Steady decline over 3 months, 30 days, less profits, less spending. Up and down like a bad heart attack EKG, inconsistent, we can't use it. Now, class durable goods refer to very large products like refrigerators and furniture, automobiles, even houses. And the thing is, people, especially businesses, order more durable goods. Car dealerships order more cars. Furniture stores order more furniture if they're selling what they have. And so they look at 2 months worth of this. If they start seeing these furniture stores like Conn's and Gallery and all the other furniture stores around the country have been ordering more furniture steadily for the last 2 months, then yeah, spending is increasing. They're selling what they have. If we see steady declines, car dealerships ordering fewer cars for 2 months, furniture stores ordering less furniture over 2 months, that predicts a drop in spending. Flat or all over the place, up and down like a yo-yo, inconsistent. Orders for new capital resources. I'm referring to like restaurant equipment, factory equipment, construction equipment, and the like. These are finished capital resources that are basically the business analog of consumer durable goods and services. If you start seeing more orders for construction equipment, more orders for fleet vehicles over 3 months, businesses are spending money because they need the equipment to do stuff. That means spending is rising. If you see a steady decline for the new finished capital resources by businesses over 3 months, businesses don't have a lot of activity. They're not needing this. Spending is declining in the business sector. Up and down, flat, can't use it. People only apply for unemployment insurance if they're laid off from their job, not because they were fired because they mooned the boss and cussed out the best customer, but if they got laid off due to no fault of their own. We see increases in applications for new unemployment insurance benefits when people are getting laid off. If this happens steadily for 16 weeks, layoff after layoff is rising and there's more applications for unemployment insurance, that tells you that people are losing their jobs. Unemployment insurance pays less than 40% of your last paycheck. Doesn't pay very well, let me add. And so people are going to be essentially having less money to spend and spending drops. 16-week decline is typically indicative of jobs are available, jobs pay better than unemployment insurance, therefore spending is going to be rising. And again, if it's all over the place, up and down like a yo-yo, you can't use it. Vendor performance is a funny thing. I used to work for a department store back after I was out of graduate school part-time while I was an adjunct professor at HCC in the early 1990s. One of the things I remembered was I was hired during a recession, and what was most notable was when we were ordering like men's wallets and shirts and belts and ties and whatnot, they came very quickly every time we had a new order, mainly because the manufacturers didn't have a lot of order. And so a very fast vendor performance, speed of delivery meant they needed money because they only got paid on delivery. What I started to notice was the economy began to improve after about 6 months, and then the vendors began to slow down their delivery, like by about a day or two. A slowdown in vendor delivery speed of replacement goods for department stores and other places like that typically indicated they have a lot of orders in the pipeline. They've got enough that they have steady cash flow. And so the slowdown means they're busy fulfilling lots of orders, not just yours. So a steady slowdown a bit in the speed of delivery is actually a good thing because it means that the suppliers of goods to retail sellers have a lot of business going on. If it's inconsistent, up and down, keeps changing, can't use it. Consumer confidence levels. There's a consumer confidence index that's gathered as a Gallup poll, has a scale of, 25 to 100. Anything that is below 40 is considered negative. 40 to 60 is considered neutral. Anything above 60 to 100 is positive. 61 to 100 is positive. They take a series of survey questions. How do you feel about the state of the economy? If you have lost your job, how confident are you going to be employed again? If you are currently employed, how confident are you going to keep working on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 meaning not confident at all, 3 meaning neutral, and 5 meaning highly confident. They cobble together this poll from about 50,000 people all over the place, talking to entrepreneurs, workers, professionals, and the like. They go all over the country. And from this, they get the Consumer Confidence Index. We look at 3 months worth of this. 3 months of readings above 60, positive consumer confidence, spending is rising. 3 months of below 40, negative consumer confidence, spending is dropping. 41 month, 80 the next month, 50 the third month. I have no idea what the heck's going on. or 3 months in the neutral zone. We really can't use it. Okay, 3 months worth of data. Now, this next one here, housing construction, building permit applications. One other thing about construction is that it employs people at all levels of society. Unskilled workers, skilled workers, professionals like architects and designers, entrepreneurs like building contractors and the like, and so forth. And the thing is, you can't start construction until you have a building permit approved. And so you look at 50 major metros, of which Houston is one of them. If we were looking at the 50 major metros and the majority, say 30 out of 50 or more, had an increase in building permit applications, that means a lot of people related to housing and construction are getting employed, which means spending is rising. If we had a noticeable drop among the major metros, like 30 or more, that would indicate spending is dropping. If we had no change, or if they were going up and down over the last 60 days, it's an unusable indicator. Now, these last two really more relate to Unit 3, so I'm not going to really elaborate on them, but you can read about them in the textbook. But here's the thing that's kind of funny. Sometimes you'll have all the indicators behaving consistently, like the average work week is rising steadily for 3 months, the stock market is rising steadily for 30 days, consumer durable goods orders and capital resource orders have steadily increased for 2 and 3 months, respectively. A noticeable drop in unemployment insurance applications, a slowdown in vendor delivery, and all positive consumer confidence levels. That's a majority of indicators predicting spending is rising. It's a safe bet we're moving up the business cycle. However, you could have the average work week not changing. Stock indices decline for 30 days. Durable goods orders increase for 2 months. What? Capital resources are flat. Unemployment insurance applications are flat. Vendor performance slows down, but consumer confidences are all below 40. I want you to notice some of what I described was negative, some was positive, some was either inconsistent or neutral. When you have all this conflict among the indicators, this is the best answer, and that is, I don't know. I can't tell. We have disagreement among indicators, and therefore it is uncertain where the economy is heading. Of course, people in the news, people in business hate uncertainty. They want to be able to predict something with certainty, but unfortunately, we don't have a perfect crystal ball here. And any economist who's going to be an honest analyst, if they have conflicting indicators, will say as much. And if somebody says, well, if you had to make a wild guess, you'd have to qualify, it is a wild guess. Still, the best answer, and this is one of those times it's correct, is I don't know. I honestly don't know. All right. So I am going to kill the screen sharing and get back to y'all here in just a second. And stop that. Okay. Folks, kind of the whole point about business cycles I wanted you to get out of this here is that this is just a reality we have to live with. It deals with our macro data and how they change. And there's ways to predict it, but they're not perfect. However, all those topics we talked about embedded within there, gross domestic product, total spending, the consumer price index and inflation versus deflation, the unemployment rate and labor force participation rate, all of these things we're going to be studying in a lot more detail here in macro as Unit 2 unfolds. Thank you all very much and have a great day.